Let us just say we have resisted participating in advertising for quite some time. We've been approached numerous times about the possibility, and we have felt, and I will speak for myself, I still feel that advertising is part of the problem, maybe a substantial part of the problem. In fact, I would even say it is something like the root of all evil, that there is something about human beings in modern times where from the moment we wake up in the morning till we go to bed at night, we are constantly being bombarded by advertisements. And while obviously there is something about advertisements that could be informative, in general, if you watch advertisements and you say, well, what percentage of what's actually going on here is telling me something I don't know, and what percentage is manipulating me into feeling some way that may have nothing to do with the product or may in fact be paradoxical, right? It happens that I may feel some way about a shampoo based on the fact that they've shown an attractive model who is ostensibly using this shampoo and having the right effect on the crowd that the person walks into. I don't know what it is, but the point is, at some level, the rational response to advertising when it is not informative should probably be to punish the advertiser, right? Because in some sense, if you take 2 bottles of shampoo, like let's say you were at the at the market and you looked at 2 bottles of shampoo and they appeared to be equivalent, but one of them you had seen an advertisement for and the other one you had not, at the same price, well, you would say, well, what fraction of the budget for this shampoo went into advertising rather than higher quality ingredients or research or whatever else might improve the product?
Well, there was, in fact, a line of products for a while. I haven't seen it in stores for a while, or maybe it's just not in the stores that I go to, called ad-free, right? That specifically was effectively created on the basis that what you see is what you get. And there's obviously always hidden costs in the form of R&D and packaging, and you don't know what salaries. But you're not paying for them to have communicated to other people who aren't you about how great their product is.
Yes. Now, the funny thing is, because we are the monkeys that we are, the idea of an entire ad-free zone of the market does not take off like wildfire, because the fact is we are manipulable, and very frequently we're most manipulated when we don't even think we're the target of an advertisement. So, oh, go ahead.
Well, this might be the right moment to talk about how advertising is hardly new to humans, right? That that there are many kinds of ways that organisms advertise to one another, and we should talk a little bit about some of those. And in fact, we probably should have pulled up some pictures, but I actually think it might be worth just talking briefly about a framing, a new kind of framing that I believe you proposed. So whereas Darwin first said, okay, we got natural selection and we've got sexual selection, where in natural, very broad brush, natural selection is about survival and sexual selection is about reproduction. You have proposed perception-mediated selection, which is that selection which is about communication between 2 entities, individuals of some sort, doesn't have to be the same species, in which the perception of the individual receiving the communicated signal decides what happens next. And the perception may not actually be reflective of reality, but if the perception is such a thing, then that's going to change behavior, and that's what needs to happen.
Right. So I didn't know that we were headed here, but
Yeah.
The point, the reason to declare a different category than the original Darwinian one is that actually there's a lot of sexual selection that isn't perception mediated and behaves much more like natural selection.
Yes.
And then there's a lot of stuff over in natural selection space that is perception mediated, where you get the same kinds of stuff you see in sexual selection. And so really my point is,
so advertising is all in perception mediated selection space.
right. Because it is inherently perception mediated, that is to say, whether you have succeeded or failed is based on the perception of some other individual, right? Are you hiding from them? Are you augmenting some characteristic? Whether or not it works is dependent on their perception. But the point is, when perception is the mechanism through which selection is acting, deception is a huge fraction of the game. Right? So sexual selection looks weird because so much of it is perception mediated, and therefore deception is all over the place.
Well, so deception isn't inherent to perception mediated selection, however, right?
Perception opens the door to deception.
Perception opens the door to deception, right? So you obviously can have honest indicators of quality with things like the song of a bird or the plumage of a bird over in traditional sexual selection space, or honest indicators of, say, toxicity with regard to, say, the clades of frogs that I have worked on, the dart poison frogs in the neotropics or the mantellas in Madagascar, which are honestly indicating with their bright coloration that they also have these toxins on board, these lipophilic alkaloids. And however, you also end up with mimics of the honestly advertising species that may basically be able to signal toxicity, say, without actually bringing along the cost of having to build the toxins.
So my point would be that the reason that sexual selection space looks weird is this arms race, right? So females in general try to force males into displays that can't be faked, right? And so in some sense, the reason that so many male displays are so expensive is that there is no way to build them out of some material that's close to free and get away with it, because they wouldn't function. So in any case, we can talk more about that another time. But let's just say that in our cautious embrace of the advertising modality, we are aiming not to manipulate, but to engage in advertising that informs you about something that you probably do want to know, and at least think about whether or not the object in question is something that you'd be better off with. And certainly deception has no place. So this is a small fraction of the available landscape of things that might be advertised that is actually available to us.
Yes, and indeed, we were approached about a number of products that we rejected, and in some cases, I think the products are good products given what they do, but we disagree with the premise of them being out there in the world in the way they are, or what their claims are, or something. And we're not here to dismiss those products publicly, but just to say that what we will end up vouching for here are things that we actually do are doing without qualms.
Right. And so in some sense, the other way I think of viewing this is that the reason that I joked about advertising being the root of all evil is that it becomes the driving force any place that it is the mechanism through which things are paid for. So you, as the viewer, become the product. You are delivered to advertisers and you get something ostensibly for free, but really it's not free because the advertisers would be paying for it if they didn't get access to your mind in a way that they could affect it. You wanted to say something?
Well, at some point here, I have a bit to talk about specifically with regard to people becoming the products when they are unwittingly so, when they don't know.
All right. Well, we'll come back. So I'll just say, in doing this, we will have to not do this to the extent that there's anything pulling us in the direction of making you and the audience into the product. So in order for you not to be the product, we have to be effectively doing double duty, which is to say, telling you things that we think are in your interest to know about. All right. Do you want to?
Yeah. So we talked about how advertising is ancient, and it opens the door to deception without being inherently deceptive. It could just be communication of state, of quality. But it certainly, that ancient and sometimes honorable history has experienced quite an acceleration of the dishonesty in modern times. So I want to just tell a brief story and then read a tiny bit from an article written by Gloria Steinem in 1990, actually. In college, I was proud to be a founding subscriber to the ad-free version of Ms. Magazine. Ms. Magazine was formed in the early 70s, founded in part by Gloria Steinem, as a kind of a feminist magazine that was about things that would pertain to things that would be of interest to women, that was not, however, a women's magazine. Women's magazines tending to pander to stereotypes, like you either belong in the kitchen and only with your children, and therefore we're going to talk about things like cooking and childcare only, or to other kinds of stereotypes. All you want to do is get a man, and so we are going to pander to and
I have never felt that way.
You haven't, but
No.
yes. You walked back in and said that. Pander to that part of womanhood, and so lots of articles on beauty and hotness and sexiness and fashion and makeup and all. And Ms. was not about that. So what had happened, though, over the course of 2-ish decades was that it had a very, very hard time attracting advertisers who did not dictate content. And so indeed, I did a big research project on this in college a couple of years after this essay that Steinem wrote came out, researching exactly how advertisers drive editorial content, specifically at magazines directed at teen girls, since I had at that point been a teen girl recently and had been an occasional reader of the magazine 17, and was, even then, as like a 13-year-old, because that's really the target audience of 17, just appalled and pretty disgusted. And, I spent less time with that magazine than a lot of people of my generation, but I spent some time with it, and I was still affected. And I didn't know then, but was not surprised to find out later, how much power the advertisers actually had on driving the actual so-called content, the editorial content of the magazine. So here's just a couple of examples. And these examples happen to be from this Steinem article, but there are plenty more out there. And this is not for teen girls magazines, but actually at Ms. magazine, Dow's cleaning products were needed to be adjacent to children or fashion editorial. Maidenform, which is a maker of bras and other apparel, required that, quote, no negative content be adjacent to the ads, including anything, quote, relating to illness, disillusionment, or large size fashion. Okay. De Beers Diamond Company prohibited magazines from placing its ads next to, quote, hard news or anti-love or romance themed editorial. Okay. So this is totally invisible to most readers of magazines, right? And it turns out that for historical reasons that I won't go into here, women's magazines and then girls' magazines really were targeted by advertisers more so than any of the other magazines because they were understood to be basically catalogs for women rather than places where women could learn about how to be in the world. So one more thing from what we know simply from Ms. Magazine, which should have been more immune to this than anything else. Here's an anecdote that Steinem reports after years of trying to get advertisers even to play ball with her. So she, not only were advertisers coming in the door and demanding what's called complimentary content that actually put their products into it or said nice things about their products in the so-called editorial content, or at least didn't put things they disagreed with on the same pages or sometimes in the same issue. But she couldn't even get some advertisers to come in the door, and here's one story. Out of chutzpah and desperation, I arrange a lunch with Leonard Lauder, president of Estee Lauder. With the exception of Clinique, which is the brainchild of Carol Phillips, none of Lauder's hundreds of products has been advertised in Ms. A year's schedule of ads for just 3 or 4 of them could save us. Indeed, as the sign of a family-owned company whose ad practices are followed by the beauty industry, he is one of the few men who could liberate many pages in all women's magazines just by changing his mind about complimentary copy. Again, complimentary copy is this euphemism for you have to change the actual content of your magazine if we are going to put ads in your magazine. Over a lunch that costs more than we can pay for some articles, I, Steinem, explain the need for his leadership. I also lay out the record of Ms. More literary and journalistic prizes won, more new issues introduced into the mainstream, new writers discovered an impact on society than any other magazine, more articles that became books, stories that became movies, ideas that became television series, and newly advertised products that became profitable, and, most important for him, a place for his ads to reach women who aren't reachable through any other women's magazine. Indeed, if there is one constant characteristic of the ever-changing Ms. readership, it is their impact as leaders. Whether it's waiting until later to have first babies or pioneering PABA as sun protection and cosmetics, whatever they are doing today, a third to a half of American women will be doing 3 to 5 years from now. It's never failed. But, he says, Ms. readers are not our women. They're not interested in things like fragrance and blush. If they were, Ms. would write articles about them. On the contrary, I explain, surveys show they are more likely to buy such things than the readers of, say, Cosmopolitan or Vogue. They're good customers because they're out in the world enough to need several sets of everything: home, work, purse, travel, gym, and so on. They just don't need to write articles about these things. No, they just don't need to read articles about these things. Would he ask a men's magazine to publish monthly columns on how to shave before he advertised Aramis products, his line for men? He concedes that beauty features are often concocted more for advertisers than readers. But Ms. isn't appropriate for his ads anyway, he explains. Why? Because Estee Lauder, he says, is selling a kept woman mentality. I can't quite believe this. 60% of the users of his products are salaried and generally resemble Ms. readers. Besides, his company has the appeal of having been started by a creative and hardworking woman, his mother, Estee Lauder. That doesn't matter, he says. He knows his customers, and they would like to be kept women. That's why he will never advertise in Ms. Right. So that's some of what's going on behind the scenes with advertisers.
Well, can I riff from there for a second?
Please.
Okay. Yeah. So this raises really the next issue that I was hoping to talk about, which is I have alleged, and I'm trying to remember where, maybe it doesn't matter, maybe it was even here on DarkHorse, that part of what is going on with the derangement of the West, and I really think, it's a psychosis of sorts that we are watching, where the loss of the ability to track arguments and to extrapolate reasonably and all of that is actually being driven by the fact that so much of the landscape through which we are interacting is advertising driven. And my point is that probably means that we are getting content that looks very different than we would otherwise be getting, not because human beings don't want the higher quality, nuanced content, but because advertisers do not want us in general in our conscious mind. They want us in our subconscious mind, where we can't necessarily track that we're being manipulated and persuaded of things that may not be factual, right? So the idea is factual content that caused you to have to think might be very desirable from the point of view of the consumer of the channel, but it would not be desirable from the point of view of an advertiser that really wants you in something, just above a sleep level of awareness. And so in our case, I think the answer is we don't want any ad for which the advertiser isn't looking to have you in your conscious mind, evaluating these claims and whether or not it adds up to you at a conscious level. That's the desire, is only that fraction of advertising that is not looking to catch you off guard.
That's really good, including when the point of the product, is actually both of the ones that we advertised here today, is to background some complexity so that you can get on with your life, right?
That's good. I hadn't even realized that connection between them. Yep.
So you do not want to be conscious of everything going on in your life at all times. That gets deeply painful and becomes unproductive very quickly. But you want to be able to call to consciousness anything that you are being exposed to, any decisions you are making, before deciding, actually, I want to set and forget. I do want to have brand loyalty over in this space because I just don't care about laundry detergent that much, or whatever it is, right? But you need at any moment to be able to say, wait, actually, it's time to reassess. And I think we will certainly never advertise anything with our words where we are trying to subvert that process.
Yeah. We will, because we scrutinize all of these things and we have been approached by many different potential advertisers, we think about them very consciously. So when we bring them to you, it's because they passed that process.
So I guess maybe we want, before we embark on our 8 pro bono ads, to talk a little, I think you've already done it, but given how we clearly feel about advertising and what kinds of harms we know it does in the world, why would we want to have anything to do with it? We're doing well right now. Thank you to the many supportive and generous viewers and listeners and people on our Patreon. We are at the moment doing well, but it is to some degree at the
discretion
of YouTube
among
and
others.
Patreon and Google, and YouTube and Google being the same thing. And so diversifying as much as possible where it is that we are, how it is that we are generating our money, so that we can continue to speak absolute truth without being dependent on the pleasure of someone. At any point that someone whom we are advertising says, actually, it's not working for me, they pull. That's fine. And at any point that someone approaches us and says, we want you to advertise for them, and we say, not for us, we just don't go there.
So I would also point out, and this is delicate because it is very difficult to prove in any way that would be clear, but we get access to the back channel information for the DarkHorse YouTube channel, for example, and it has ceased adding up. The podcast appears to be more popular than ever, which you would expect. News of it would spread, and people seem to very much like it. On the other hand, we see a trend in viewership coming from Google that clearly indicates that in spite of the fact that it's popular with those who see it, that they're showing it to fewer people. And so what does this portend? Would they boot us, at the point that they thought it wouldn't cause a stir? I don't know. But let us just say it is a vulnerable position. And from the point of view, of our long-term ability to speak the truth, irrespective of what comes at us, it is important that we carefully take this step.
Indeed. Did you want to say anything about advertising to children, or should we save that?
Yeah, it's probably worth, as long as we're spending the time here. I would just say that, as a measure of how dangerous advertising has become, I have for at least 15 years been making the claim that I believe there is no defense of advertising to children, that it is impossible to come up with a rationale whereby it is acceptable, for example, to have a company that produces food advertising to children in a way that might change what it is they desire to eat or how much they desire to eat, and that clearly we have an epidemic of ill health based in inability to regulate desire for food, both type and amount, amongst children, for which there is no known cause other than the fact that we have lots of corporations pushing various things in the direction of children. So anyway, I keep asking, can anybody come up with a defense of the right of a company to advertise to a child who is presumably without the defenses that an adult might have? And even adults aren't all that well defended, right? And so I guess what I would say in closing is that the degree of harm that comes from dysregulating children's interaction with something like food, and the same could be said of a lot of other things, what it is they desire and are therefore persuaded to pursue, that advertising to children effectively maims people, right? It does things that are as harmful to them as, I don't know, child molesting, something like that. And to the extent that the society allows this to continue and doesn't do anything, even though it is at least very difficult and maybe impossible to come up with a justification that makes any sense, is a measure of how much we have fallen into the trap of imagining that advertising is just like a feature of the landscape and not something that we grant access.